0G is zero graphics. It's also my name, OG, my second name, ÓGaora. And most people in Ireland can't speak Irish anymore, so they can't say my name. So 0G was the name for a couple of reasons. But that idea of zero graphics was, in my opinion, a lot of graphic design is becoming commoditized. There's large aspects of it whereby if you want to make a living, it's not the same as to how it used to be. And even aside from that, what I was most interested in is establishing relationships with clients. So this photograph where you just basically have these little armchairs, where my mother-in-law worked in a factory here in the middle of town where they used to make these. Mm-hmm. So it's not very designery. I don't think leopard print in old style chairs is what it's about. But what the intention was that we would focus on helping people with ideas. And we would help about making those ideas visual. And if it's used typography, great. If it's used image, great. If it was just about storytelling, that was okay too. So what I was trying to do was escape, in a way, the commodity of that the transaction is someone gives us a brief, we create something and hand over artwork and they give us money. We wanted it to be more of an exchange of ideas. So even the way in which you see this studio, 0G has always been based on this idea. We don't normally have a group of this size having a chat. But when people talk about the studio, they'll often say, we don't really know what 0G do, but go down to Capel Street and just sit on the couches and have a conversation. And then that's the start of our design process. Mm-hmm. So as a practice, we don't say we are typographic designers, we are art directors, we don't come from that perspective. So there's a range of different people. So while it started out with me and one other person who I came to assist me, there's now about 16 of us, and it works across a very wide range of industries and skill sets. And some of these are just some identities that we've created, but in some ways the identities are really only just a small touch point, and I'll talk about one or two of these projects. When I use an image to talk about what we do, this is my son. He's now studying design in Dunleary. So you might, if you saw a red-haired guy that looks about, I suppose 17 years older than this kid, that's my son. And when I set up 0G, I used to use this photograph to explain what we do. And I don't know if the story translates into Polish, but when Cillian was 4, he and his friends used to play a game where they came in off the street and he'd get a big black chunky marker and he'd write on his forehead. And when he did that, he'd jump off the couch and in his mind, the house turned into Hogwarts and he was Harry Potter. And all that symbol was doing was saying, this is the game that we're playing. This is the relationship that we're establishing between each other. Therefore, if I'm doing this, that's a different symbol and a different story. And therefore, my character can do different things. So we came from the point of view of that this is about storytelling and creating symbols that can carry the meaning of that story. And we also come from the point of view of design, and when we create identity, it's like an empty vessel. The client will fill that with meaning over time. They will tell their story. And so what we do in this room is we help draw that story out. We help give people the confidence to tell that story. And we create that vessel that will contain the story over time. That's what the identity is. And so that's the story of what we tell, what we do. And within that context, you can see there's a slight difference in terms of the symbol that's being used. I think he was a David Bowie fan. Just got it wrong. So the reason we put this in is that it isn't always about how accurate and how consistent are you. To my experience, sometimes design can get so constipated by its desire to show how meticulous it is. And I never thought I could be a designer, because most people I knew who were designers didn't perspire. They were very tidy. They wore white jeans that never got dirty. I went in and originally studied product design. But I really wanted to be a fine artist. I dropped out and went and worked on building sites in America when I was 19, and then decided I'd come back and study design. But all the while it's about stories, and it's about symbols that capture those stories and bring it to life. One of the projects that you might have seen around town is Trinity College wanted to create a small space for science. They didn't know what to call it, and they didn't have an identity. And essentially it was a very small thing with very little funding. And so the identity that we developed was this identity that was understanding what the scientific method was. So when we think about science, it's not actually about technology. It's about doing an experiment and asking yourself, is the answer yes or no? Is it a double X or an XY chromosome? Is it a base or an acid? Is it right or is it wrong? Is it O or is it 1? Is it science or is it art? And so the identity was based around this interaction, and the positioning and the story that it was built on is the idea of where ideas meet. And so that's just that little mark on the forehead that allowed the people who were setting it up to say, this isn't about technology, this isn't about the latest flashy thing, this is about people having a conversation, because sometimes science is about the ethics of should we do it or not. Is climate change man-made or it's just a natural cycle? And therefore it's about that kind of idea of engagement. And what the space was about putting up themes and subjects. They've plastics there at the moment, but it was about creating this framework. So we created the initial story, the initial identity, and then developed that out into a guidelines, and then other companies have brought that to life over the last 10 years. So a lot of the work that we do is not that we want to create everything. We want to create that core idea that can go out into the world and other people can run with. And for me, as a student, it was I found it very interesting. I used to go and work in Burger King in Copenhagen every summer as a way of turning my brain off for a little while. But one year I got a bursary to go and visit different design companies. And I remember visiting 11 Danes Design, who had created a brand new identity for Novo Nordisk, big global corporation. And then I went and visited Contrapunct, and Contrapunct were creating the guidelines that brought that identity to life and allow other people to do it. And then I visited another studio, Peter Bausted, and what they were doing was taking the guidelines of the identity and creating material with it. And I found that quite interesting because I'd never been exposed to the idea that not all design studios are the same and some have different focus. So what I was interested in at that stage was trying to move into that space where it was about the idea rather than only about the form. So this was another little project that we did. Does it play? See how this goes, sorry about this. This is an identity that we created for a government initiative called Creative Ireland, or Clór Dánach in Irish, so it works in both English and Irish. And typically when people create images of creativity and culture, there's often this explosion of energy. You know, there's that trope of where people use a plume of brightly coloured pigment exploding into the world. Whereas what the project we were doing with the government for this was more about what culture and identity is about creating a common ground, a common space that people come into, almost like a piazza. And so this was part of a government initiative, and the identity could expand and flex and change. But just again, it's that idea of that simple little mark making. So you'll see this on posters all around town, just this symbol, not that element. But this little animation was used at the launch, again, to try and change the narrative about creativity isn't always about an explosion of energy. Sometimes it's about drawing people in so that they have that common ground of communication or experience that culture is. This is an identity that we created for an art centre up in Navan, and it was designed by an Irish architectural firm called Grafton Architects. And essentially it's a black basalt building that sits on top of a platform of light. And so we created a typographic mark that represented the building. But we felt that this on its own would not be acceptable to the rather simple local authority. People are looking for meaning in what they do. And so we said, well, this, it's just representing the building. But we asked the question, well, what do art centres exist for? Why should a local authority, local government, pay money to have a centre for the arts? And they couldn't answer the question. So, well, we just have one because, we were given money for it. And so the story that we told, solstice is that moment when the sun is, where the day and night are equal. And is it solstice? Winter solstice? No, it's when so the winter solstice is when the sun is at its lowest. And near where this art centre was is a place called Newgrange in Ireland, which is a place that's about 3,000 or 4,000 years old. And on the 22nd of December, the light comes down the channel into the middle of this old Neolithic building and lights it up. And so that's why they named it solstice. But what we spoke about is it's not about the light of the sun once a year, but the idea of why do birds sing every morning when the sun comes up. And we just spoke about this idea of it's just like this simple celebration of life. The sun has risen up again and we have another day. And really the art doesn't need to have a commercial function. It's not an instrument. It exists as part of what it is to be alive. And so we had all these images of different birds that they could use at different times. And the birds were not essential to the identity, but they became an element that allowed the client to assign meaning to it. And we introduced other elements like a nest, and we developed a simple typeface. And this typeface was designed that through just a minimal number of elements, they could create the full alphabet. So that when we came to use it as part of the fabric of the building, it was used for movable type on the outside. It was also brought through onto various other fixed elements of signage. It was painted onto concrete. And so it became a very simple, robust, and it was used also within the typography of print collateral and materials. The bird was still there. This was an identity as well that we created for a client in Omaha, Nebraska. And this was a client I'd worked with before, and he was building a very large primary care health centre in a place called Ciarán in the middle of Omaha, Nebraska, which is in the middle of nowhere. And you had to take 3 flights to get to Omaha, Nebraska. And he had developed this concept called Think Primary Care, and he asked if I'd develop an identity for it. And the whole thing around care and primary care is that it's not just about one person who's a patient. It's about these different layers of care. And often it's presented as this, like a target of these different concentric circles, and here's the patient, and here's the doctor, and here's the supporting care. But rather than doing that or doing the identity, what I wanted to do is create something that felt like it was alive. I wanted to create something that, rather than creating excitement, it just created a sense of calm. And so I just created this, and I head over to Omaha, and it was a really bright sunny day. It was Friday the 13th of June, and I presented to him. And I said, well, it's just circles, and it's about rather than them being concentric, they overlap, and it's about how they interact with each other. And it's based on the Fibonacci series. That's how the proportions are there, so that there is this relationship of 5, 8, 13. So the kind of word, the number 13 is important in terms of this. And his response was, what? You came all this fucking way and all you've got is a circle. A fucking circle. This is his words, not mine. You'd never hear me swearing. Not. And that was his reaction. And I'm normally quite verbose, and this is a client who is a very good storyteller. And we were sitting in the room because the room was dark because it was a bright sunny day in Omaha and it gets very hot there. But I just left this playing on a screen that was about twice the size of this. And I said, yeah, it's just a fucking circle. And I didn't try and defend it. I didn't try and say anything as to why it was good. I didn't show it all in application. I just said, yeah. And we sat there quietly in the dark for about 5 minutes, and silence can sometimes be your friend. And after about 5 minutes, he started to fill it with meaning. And for him, it was very important because he moved to America in 2013 after the economy had crashed here. We were there on Friday the 13th presenting it. This was based on the number 8:13 ratio. And so he started to, in his own personal experience, layer all these things and all this kind of meaning into it. And he started to fill it with his meaning. And that's all it needs to do. It doesn't have to come pre-filled. It just needs to have the feeling that supports that. And so he went from his response of it's just a fucking circle to 2 weeks later bringing all his team into a darkened room and just playing this on the screen and telling them the story about what the vision and the idea behind the company was. And he played some John Vincent McMorrow music in the background and people were in tears. So again, that idea of how you fill something with meaning or you let the client fill it with meaning. And then there was a piece of work to bring that to life. This was the building that was ultimately made. This identity here, you can see, like we brought that just a fucking circle, that's 3 stories high. And actually this here is on backlit glass at night. This is internally illuminated. There's about 3,000 LEDs in behind here. And this had to be printed in ceramic ink. And ceramic ink is the opposite to normal ink. Yellow is opaque. Blue and red are transparent. And so we had to try and work out how, so if you looked at that up close, that's what that looked like. Because we couldn't use normal raster structures. If you had the inks overlapping, you no longer controlled how they were going to work. It looked completely different at day and night. So we ended up having to do a load of experiments. That's what the inside of it looked like. And it was inspired by churches, Catholic churches built in the 60s in Ireland. And as part of a previous project, we had gone looking at those. And there's a lot in terms of just information systems and iconography, and right down to all of the artworks were designed. And the whole element around this is for older people with chronic illnesses. And therefore, how do we have something that has this kind of scale? How do we make that feel intimate? And so it was everything down to actually designing wallpapers like you might maybe find in your granny's. But when you look at, this is the client, when you look at them up close, there's various different elements of the Fibonacci series that come through to create something that looks like it's a floral pattern, but up close it's all actually about science and medicine and care. And that would flow through everything to etched wood. And we created a 100-meter frieze of typography that didn't repeat. So for 100 meters, it was just all completely different. So that was kind of a project whereby the core idea is filled with meaning by the client, but still as a designer, we need to bring that across. And the reason we could have it animated, there was a lot of technology in the building, and so a lot of the touch points, you only ever saw that identity alive and moving and breathing. This is an identity that we created more recently for the Design and Crafts Council of Ireland. Oh, sorry, did that go in? I was going to share a typeface with you there, but it's obviously missing. Have you guys any questions? I know I'm just talking and rabbiting on here. Do you want to stop me or ask me anything as I'm going?
I can have a question.
Yeah, shoot.
Because the previous one is what I would, let's say it's like a dynamic identity.
Yeah.
So what's your experience with working with this in print? Because usually I think people end up having one of the favorite instance, let's say, which they use only, so it's not fully used, let's say, on how it was designed. Was it the same? What's your experience on this?
Yeah, so it's less about the single use and more about actually it becomes a lot more problematic for other individuals to apply it. So a lot of times so that was an identity that we crafted every single element, from the iPad screens that the users had to the information system. But when you have an adaptive identity, at some point, if there's any kind of distribution, it's very hard to keep that alive if it moves into print. And I think the element around that is just to recognize, for us, the idea of it being adaptive and the idea of it moving wasn't about that mark or symbol had to be moving all the time. And sometimes we didn't use the mark or symbol. But you might say, okay, we created a whole load of books, that people received a small little traditional hardback book when they joined the centre, but it would have had their name personalised on the front. So each person's name appeared within the same typography as the title of the book. So the idea of things changing or adapting or being personal existed within the spirit of the identity rather than only with this item. But that element of a movable identity, unless you're a TV station and even then you have one letterhead, I think it's the idea of it. We didn't get too concerned with insisting that every application had to be fundamentally different. Right. You know, and in some ways I've probably seen very few adaptive identities in practice that are, although anyone I see
it's a nice concept, but
it's great for conferences. Everyone loves an adaptive identity and it tells a good story. But to what extent that actually people will focus in on particular marks. I don't know if I have it here, but what we love when we do a mark like this or something else and someone paints it on a mural or someone writes it on their school bag, or we did one for the centenary of the revolution in Ireland or the insurrection in Ireland, and there's people in Australia making the marks on the beach and taking photographs and putting it up. So it's that idea, sometimes it's less about something having to be moving and more that something is owned and not precious. So some marks and some identities need to be treated preciously. If you're a bank, you might be worried about that. Other things, I think, can be given out into the world, and it's more about how they can be used and played with. I mean, MTV is one of the few adaptive identities that seem to kept it going. I thought I threw all the slides over here. We worked with Bobby Tannum to design a typeface that supported this. So I might just see if that's here. In case. You'll be able to edit this out, won't you?
Yes.
Actually, I'll keep going. So one of the things that Eva had mentioned was the Abbey Theatre. So the Abbey Theatre is an interesting theatre. Have you been down there?
We've been yesterday.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a kind of curious. They celebrated 100 years around 2006, and then they immediately went broke. Celebrating their 100th birthday, they ran out of money, and a new director was put in, and the new director would talk about the political nature of theatre. If you were my age and you lived in Ireland or England, you'd know this character. It might be lost on you guys, but he was this little revolutionary living in a small suburban house in London. But he was never going to change anything. It was all rhetoric. But when we got the brief from the Abbey Theatre, what's funny is that, and I don't know what it's like in Poland, but government tenders or where European tenders, it's a nightmare. It is. It prevents people establishing relationships. It turns everything into commodity. But when we got the project, or when we were asked to tender for it, we just went in and we used this slide, in that what they were most focused on is getting estimates for how it would be to print and create the identity. So we said, well, this is what you're asking us to do. It's all about these objects. And if we add up all of them, it's like hundreds of thousands of them. That's a lot of wasted paper. That's a lot of, and this was 12 years ago. So these days, print is becoming less and less, as you'll know. But at the time, we were kind of questioning to what extent it should be all about that. We were also questioning that they were a little bit unsure. This was the original mark for the for the theatre that was created. It's a famous woodcut of an Irish mythological figure, and it's Queen Maeve, I think, and the Wolfhound, which is a famous Irish character, the Irish Wolfhound. And this was used by the Abbey all through its 100 years, and then it reached a point where it didn't know, should we use it, should we not? And there was this schizophrenic thing of the only reason they're famous is because of their history. Their history is what makes them the national theatre, but yet they were kind of wondering, where do we fit? And so what we did is we got involved in trying to understand the story of the Abbey Theatre, because it was going through a lot of change. A lot of people were being let go. It was being restructured so it could stay alive. And our methodology is very much co-development. We work very closely. So a bit like the client in Omaha, him filling that story is an important part of the process, and that informs what we do as we move forward. And with here, we wanted to connect everyone who is working in the Abbey with the idea of the reputation of the theatre, that each of them contribute to it in some ways. They're a part of it. The theatre isn't something separate, they are it. And therefore each one of them got a book that spoke to them about what it stood for. And there was no two books were the same. There was about 100 books, each one was different. And it would just talk about what the aspect was in terms of how theatre plays a role within social and political change, and about what the different values were. And then at the very end of this little book, we said, and here is our design brief. So we engaged with them all the way through, and they said, now we're going to start actually together, this is what we're going to set out to do from a point of view of design. You know, that it'll be one brand rather than all these different things. And that it'll be about confidence. How does it appear inherently confident? And part of that confidence is about celebrating its history rather than worrying if it's going to be seen to be out of date, if it recognises its history. And we also thought a lot about what way, this is the environment that a lot of the posters exist within. And how do we allow the posters to work within that environment? So this is some of the deck that we went through in terms of development and looking at loads of different ways that we might approach it. And, you know, a lot of times there's all this element of cutting type and making it seem like it's an optical illusion and some kind of interesting kind of layouts where it's very conscious that a designer has done this. And every poster that we were seeing for theatre around Dublin, everything had to be at an angle, very self-conscious. And we thought, fuck that, let's just try and keep it really simple. And let's just own what they have. So we explored the A, that can contain things, and it couldn't contain all of these. We looked at these different kinds of designs, strongly typographic and all the rest. At the end of the day, we just came back of, let's just make it these two things. Let's just bring them together into one and let them own that. So it's not rocket science, it's very straightforward. But it just allows them to move it forward, and then over time this image might mutate into other shapes and other things. There's my daughter. So, very bad piece of design there, but I kind of like the NAFA. I mean, what's funny when you go down, you have the experience in the Abbey Theatre. Because you can go to the Daniel Libeskind designed Bord Gáis Energy Theatre, and it feels like what people think a national theatre should be. And I remember at the time when we were doing the design, there was people, there was a woman from England who was the head of the marketing team, and they were saying, oh, it doesn't feel like a national theatre. And I said, yeah, but does it feel like the Abbey Theatre? They said, well, yes. So I said, what's more important, that it feels like the Abbey or it feels like a national theatre? And so it's about, in some ways, there's a certain intimacy, there's a certain lo-fi nature of it. It's not Danny Libeskind architecture. It's very much lost in a certain moment of time. But that is part of its charm and part of its authentic character. Yeah. But they didn't have anything that if anyone was going, oh, I've been to the Abbey Theatre, that they could be photographed in front of an icon. So so this here started to become the icon that when people visited it, they go into the lobby and they'd be photographed beside the A. And this was the kind of approach that we said, there'll be no fancy design, center axis, no bullshit, dump. You don't have to be a great typographer to do it. And we evolved, so this was the early kind of sketches, that the typography would always represent tradition and straight hierarchy, and the images would have something that would try and be disconcerting. So the vessel is consistent and the content is where the spice comes from. And we developed a typeface, slightly rounded out the corners. It's based on trade Gothic, but we changed some of the letter forms, like letter R and so on, that brought it back to the wood block typographic posters that the Abbey would have had in the early 20th century. And we also, with all those print items, we said, you're not going to print this, 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 or this. Anything that's printed should be something that should feel like people feel that it has value. And they used to print things in A4 in full colour throughout. And it felt a little bit like going to see, Legally Blonde or some kind of West End musical. It didn't feel like it had any sense of its own inherent value. And so what we did is we changed the inside to just be in single colour, but we printed it in a 418 Pantone, so it had a very particular character. We moved away from coated paper to a bulky uncoated stock that was cheaper and gave it more substance. And it also allowed us to perfect bind them and give them a spine. So that the thing is that any of the visual or print output at the time we felt should feel like an archive that would amass over time to document what was happening in the theatre. And so what we found before we were working on the identity, when we would go and to a play, a lot of times people had folded the programs in half and just discarded them. Whereas here people started to come into the theatre and see if they could buy the program even if they didn't make it to the play. And that was fine for those 10 years. We worked with the Abbey for 10 years and then we walked away. This was a poster, Tales for Ballycumber. We had the crow strung up here in the room for about 3 or 4 days, photographing it from different angles. It started to smell quite badly after a while, so I had to keep it in the fridge. But the whole idea here was, this is a story about the suicide of a guy. And what we liked about this is that it reminded us of the Pieta, with Jesus spread over the lap of Mary. And just that idea of, and there's an element to, there's a myth in Ireland that the crows will leave the Tower of London when the British leave Ireland. So it's that idea of where you can have things that don't actually have to have overt symbolism. But Sebastian Barry, a lot of his plays are about recognising Protestant identity within an Irish culture. The whole idea that Irish identity and Catholicism being interwoven is not always the case. A lot of Irish national identity was expressed and created by people who were Protestant, identifying with the idea of national identity as transcending religion. So some of these would carry symbolism that would exist within an Irish context for people. John Gabriel Borkman. This is Bookworms. It's about the play about book clubs, a lot of Pinot Grigio, so wrong. Terminus. And so with all of these, this was interesting. What we really enjoyed with doing these posters was the conversations that we had with the authors. And one of the things that we gave ourselves as a choice is that you might notice none of these posters show photographs of the ensemble or the main actor coming out of the darkness. And a lot of the theatre posters we saw, the poster was always dark. It was like a Rembrandt painting. The characters have to come out. It creates drama. And it's almost expected. Where we felt if we have white posters in that landscape that we were talking about there where these appear, they would jump out. And so for the first few years we said no portraits, no black posters, no dramatic shadows. We need to communicate this in a way that uses a different visual language. And when it came to Conor Macpherson, who's a very well respected author, he turned up with all these books of examples of what he wanted the theatre poster to look like, all with people coming out of the shadows and black. And we insisted that it would be a white poster. He was insisting that it would not be. So what we did is myself and my son went into the garage at home and we took some white posters and we set them on fire. And we photographed them at various different degrees of burning in order to be able to expose the dark image that the playwright wanted. Now, we never got to the full thing, but at least he got us to see us burning the white posters since he didn't like them. And so we would have had different stages. The posters would appear around town in different stages of being burned. And that for us was kind of a nice idea. We also did some animated stuff.
A very simple idea for this play. That is to bring all his characters to Bath. But of course, it's not just a place for a cure or to take the waters. It's a place where you find a wife with a fortune, where rivalries are played out, where amidst the whole round of masquerades, trysts and routs, arguments develop, people at cross purposes, plots are developed, betrayals, treasons, and finally, of course, a duel.
So this simple After Effects work to bring it to life was used as well. And then what we want to try and do is make things that felt iconic, so that when they appeared on websites, that they almost worked like a logo for the play. These are some of the other ones. Again, she would wrap around the back. This is about coming of age. And so we started to finally relent and allow some actors appear on the posters. What's nice is when people actually start to play with your posters. That's the lovely thing, I think, about doing work that's out on the street, that people interact with it. Not always positively, but to something nice. There's your real kind of adaptive identity in practice. And then some were like this poster here took about a month because we wanted to make a little moving poster that went with it. And trying to get the consistency of blood was really hard. It's nice doing Shakespeare posters sometimes because there's been so many posters done for them. You're trying to reinvent the idea while still have it recognizable. And this is just that idea of how we brought a particular texture and character to the typography, and just the overall approach, so that there was a nice. It was kind of moving away from what we saw for a lot of the theatre companies, which was only Helvetica, pure modern, that kind of slightly coming out of London National Theatre, which is beautiful, but it's about, we felt that actually having texture felt truer to the nature of the work. And then the usual bullshit guidelines that need to be created. Some of this was just about playing with the language of lead actors and supporting roles. When we come to talk about typography, allow the personality to kind of come through. Trying not to keep it too rulesy, just giving people little tips so that it's not a lot of detail, and keeping it very simple, and just more about the spirit. This is a book that we created. Any questions on the Abbey? We walked away from the Abbey 3 years ago. We had worked with them for 10 years and they had a change of director, and when the new directors, is two people from the National Theatre Scotland came in, really nice guys. But 10 years is a long time to work on one client, and in that time their team got very used to us, the marketing team that were in the Abbey, and so while new directors came in, you still have that team that's there. And we met with the directors when they joined and said, look, we have the contract to do the Abbey for the next 3 years, but we're happy to walk away. If you're coming in, you need to effect a change. And the theatre, we've consolidated it, but now you need to unthink it. And they said, no, we're happy for you to do it. But that would mean their commitment to working with us. And they didn't have the time for that. And so we're in this kind of middle ground of doing work where the internal team feel that it's still business as usual. The directors need to effect a change, and the zero-G team are trying to keep everyone happy and probably keeping no one happy. So I decided at that point, let's just let the digital agency take it over. So that the digital agency it starts with digital and moves into print, where we were starting with print and moving into digital. And I think that that's been a fruitful move for them. And it also means that while it's a little bit difficult in terms of continuity, it breathes fresh life into the project. So we had 10 years that we really enjoyed, probably 7 years that we really enjoyed. There's a period of time that you need to move on. People get used to a way of working, and it can be hard to subvert that. And so that was, for me, an important. It's always good to know when to leave the party. I spoke about post-Vatican II churches, so I thought I'd throw this in, because I found it interesting visiting Poland. I went to, as I said, Krakow a couple of times, and it's interesting looking at the relationship, say, with the Catholic Church and design. So in an Irish context, we're nearly out of under the yoke of the Catholic Church as a defining institution. When Ireland got independence, essentially the Catholic Church institutionally came in and said, okay, we've been the government in waiting, we're going to own this now. They were anti-nationalist until nationalism was on the up, and then said, okay, we're part of Irish identity. And so health and education was all very stitched in. And so for me, as a kid growing up in Dublin, I would have been forced to go along to Mass by my parents in a church that was built in 1967 in concrete and breeze blocks and so on. But I loved the architecture because it was one of the few places you saw modern architecture in Ireland. And when you actually look at the visual language of those churches, they weren't full of paintings of Jesus on the cross with the blood dripping off his elbows. The stained glass, you could have been in a Buddhist retreat centre. And actually what was kind of happening in the 70s and in the 60s was a kind of a graphic language or a visual language that in some ways opened up the challenge to the Catholic Church. But I found it interesting, the fact of that while we reject Catholicism, that doesn't mean that we need to reject these elements. So when I look around me, I'd see that West Coast American, Californian Buddhist retreat centres, let's pamper ourselves. Kind of go, you know, it just feels more kind of a vain culture, that there's other languages that we can draw upon. So I've always been very interested in terms of the language of that, to appropriate it, to take it away necessarily from what it's about. And this was about an architect who had designed a lot of, a guy called Liam McCormack. He was a very interesting man. He was the first Catholic, I must sound very political or something like that, I don't know, but he was interesting in that in the north of Ireland, he was the first Catholic mayor of Derry, London Derry. He was an architect. He was also a man who suffered from depression, and he was a very avid sailor. And it was really looking at these different dynamics of his life like a sketchbook, because oftentimes architecture books can seem very formal and very serious and very self-aggrandizing, where this man used to get into a bath in his when he was depressed, and he had a little hole cut in the wall over his bath where he had a projector, and he would project films that he took from when he was out sailing onto the wall to try and calm himself. And just that element of all these kind of stories and textures were things that we found very interesting. And you know, when we come to design a book, you know, we can talk about grids and we can talk about all that kind of stuff and baseline and X height and I love all that shit. It's great. There's a mathematics and sequencing and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, the reason I was putting that on there is that when we look at a book and how we experience a book as a three-dimensional object in the first place, I really only look at books from the point of view of flow. How do they flow? Not how do they work on the page alone, but how does it work as I move through it? And so when we moved through this, there was a variety of different things that were taking place, but it's how do we have flow, and then when do we drive punctuation? This is Burt Church. It was voted it was built in '67, the year I was born, and it was voted the building of the millennium in Ireland as kind of representative of the best piece of Irish architecture. And it's kind of very strange considering culturally we all reject the Catholic Church. You know, I'm not a practicing Catholic, but I can appreciate there's so much about pre-Christian Ireland that is captured within this building. So much about a relationship with art and with nature that's captured within how this is. But back to the book design, this book was really about trying to show a life and have that continuity and then punctuate it appropriately. And then, like we see with the Abbey Theatre, bringing in appropriate degrees of texture, of how you can have a book within a book, and you're breaking the convention of that, and you can sit between them the same way as this was a man who had lives within other lives. The same way each of us, we can be a brother, we can be a father, we can be a friend, we can be a lover. We have these different books within books. So this was kind of a nice opportunity to explore the texture and the character of that. There's another book that we did recently for the Special Olympics, and we worked with Casa de Carlota, a design company based in Barcelona, and they work with people with intellectual disabilities, and so that they form part of the design team in terms of creating the work. So we worked with them on developing some typefaces and typography that we were able to integrate into the way in which the book was designed. And again, it's just giving it punctuation and character. Personally, I like a lot of texture. I like when things don't feel perfect. I like when you have that sense of the accidental within what's happening. These are the guys we worked with, Dutch designer who oversees the work. And then this is another book that we did. I think I'm more or less finished now, you'd be glad to know. We did a lot of work for the centenary of the Irish centenary in 2016. And it's a very interesting space because the government were really unsure as to how they should do this. In 1966, we celebrated 50 years since we tried to push the British out. And in 1968, that's when the shit kicked off up north. And so there's a lot of worries about how, when you signify something in history, it can start to establish a story and a narrative that can give permission for new things to happen that maybe you rather didn't. So the violence that happened in the late 60s and moved all the way through to 98 in the north of Ireland, some people worried was that because we actually helped to fuel that by celebrating Ireland's nationalist aspirations in 1966. So it was interesting, they went and they launched how they were going to do this in under a thing called Ireland Inspires. And the people who were in government who were organising this came and spoke to us about it and said, this is what we're thinking of doing, blah, 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 and we'd like you to help. And we said, well, have you decided that you're definitely going to do, it's all about Ireland Inspires and how brilliant we are? Yes. And it's going to be branded in this way? Yes. Well then, what do you need us for? Because we don't think that's what you should do. So they went and they launched it, and they put up a video that had U2 and the Irish football team, and it's all about how brilliant Ireland was and about how we're an inspirational nation. And there was protesters outside the GPO where they launched it, and 30 minutes after they launched, they took down the video and they removed all the branding, because it didn't actually recognise the significance of the movement. They didn't have a story that put what happened in 1916 into context. And so they came back to us about 4 months later and said, look, we know we fucked up. We'd really love if you could work with us on this. And we're relaunching in 10 days. We need an identity, a website, and we need everything done in 10 days. Which was great. Because then we said, fine, shut up, sit down. We're going to tell you what we're doing, because there's no real... So my father was an actor. He had played the role of one of the revolutionaries in 1966 on a big TV movie. So as a kid, I'd been looking at this stuff for 50 years. So when it came for it to happen, I had an idea of what I wanted the narrative to be. And so what we did is we didn't use the word Ireland, we just used 1916, 2016, just used numbers. And we introduced, I don't think I have it up here, but there's an element where we created an identity around it. And it proved to be an important element within the overall programme the government went out with. And because it started to reshape the narrative. And it said, we didn't get independence in 1916, we didn't get independence until 1922. But what these 7 people did who signed this declaration, they put a line under one chapter of history and started another. And all we were doing is recognising a moment in history. And the other element is that we wanted to create an identity that was pluralistic. So that's to say that it could represent anyone. So if you had family who were fighting in the British Army in 1916 in France, that 1916 was just an important year to you. 485 people were killed in Ireland. 5,000 were killed in one day in the Battle of Somme from Ireland. So it was about how do you create identity that means that people of different persuasions and different political outlooks can feel as if they're part of what's being commemorated. So that's what we worked on. And this was a book that was put together at the end of it. We brought in a little element. This is the identity that we created. So again, there's no words, because for some people to use the word Ireland is political. Is it Republic of Ireland? Is it Ireland? Is it Northern Ireland? So just by keeping it numeric and also just avoiding any iconography that could be seen to be either nationalist or unionist or otherwise, while at the same token giving it an underlying feeling that actually is proud of the national identity. You're using that empty vessel. People can fill it with their meaning, but you have enough shape for it. So this little element, and the book was also done in 2 languages, Irish and English. And what we want to do oftentimes when bilingualism is used in Ireland, they do one language in one side of the book and another language at the other. We wanted them both to sit together intimately. And that kind of came all the way through everything that we were doing and handled in different ways at different times. I have other projects, but I think I've been speaking enough. Do you want me to keep going? Are you sure?
Yes.
Right, anyway, because it's listening to someone talk, especially after a day like today, you can probably want to fall asleep. But I'll give it another couple of projects. Do you need to go to the bathroom? Blue box over there. You might need to bring a coat. It's very cold. Off you go, you're grand. It's in there, blue box. Yeah, just through that door on your left-hand side. Yeah, you're grand. This is a project that we were asked to do a few years back. Just by the way, this kind of stuff isn't what we do. I don't pay my bills doing this. A lot of what we do is large identity work. Mm-hmm. All these kind of projects I'm sharing with you are things that we just do because we like.
Dessert.
Yeah, dessert. Yeah, an aperitif. So this was a project called "What Happens Next is a Secret," and the curator from the Museum of Modern Art came and said, "Look, I don't know what I'm asking you to do, but I'm going to tell you what I'm doing. I'm curating an exhibition that's going to take place over 6 weeks, and that exhibition is going to be changing all through that 6 weeks. And I don't know what I'm going to be putting in and out of the exhibition over that period of time. But I want to design something to document this in some way." So I said, well, let's just make a book that will change over that period of time. So what we did is that we published, when the exhibition opened, we published this little modest publication in one colour. And we printed, I can't remember. In addition, I think we printed about 2,000 of them. But we only stapled 480. So 480 of this little book was produced, and you can see the name of it is What Happens Next is a Secret. And the way we decided to take the book was, if that was our starting point, what we decided to do is let's take that and overprint that with a second colour 2 weeks later. So a few weeks later, she sent me, here's some more images of things I'm putting into the exhibition. So what we did is we printed those in here and we folded it differently. So you put in a sheet, you print it this side and this side, and then you take it out and you can fold it depending on the way it goes in the folding machine, it shifts. So we folded it differently, which meant that some of the pieces that appeared in here that didn't seem to join up, that actually some of the bits that joined up no longer joined up and other bits that didn't did. So I could now read that quote in its entirety. And then a couple of weeks later, and you'll see when we printed it, we scratched out the first ISBN number and put in a second ISBN number. And then she sent us more shit and we decided we'd print that. So we overprinted it, the ones that were left over, and only folded and stapled 480. And so again, that appears in a different sequence, and then when certain images were being removed, we just overprinted them. And then at the end, it's gone. The exhibition was over. And what we started to do was build in things here, like the word action became accretion. And what started out life as just on, okay, the exhibition is on now. So you had this element of as it moved through, the meaning and the relationship shifted. And that was facilitated by just overprinting and putting the sheet in this way up, this way down, this way up, this way down when folding. So it gave you different sequences and different combinations and revealed different things in every way. And then at the very end of it, and so these were left out. These were left out at different stages through the exhibition for people to pick up. And then at the end of it, we just printed a sleeve. So the four of them came together. So it was a way of using the print process and the design process where we designed in the first instance to know that something else would come, but we wouldn't know what would. So that made it fun. And so you kind of ended up with moving through, as I showed you there, these different elements that ultimately end up with it gone. So you don't get to do those too many times, really. And that just shows you the sequence. So each time we just overprinted one book on top of the other, and it's a different ISBN. And in a way, it was an example of what we do when we're working systemically, you know. So that's it. Naughty Words is a book that we produced a few years back. But I'll finish it with one final thing. Every year we make a little gift. I'm nearly over now. One year we made a birdhouse for people's soul. So it's somewhere that their soul could live. It's based on a song by They Might Be Giants. First year we produced a book called Naughty Words, where we were looking at words. So this is published in 2004. So this is a book called Naughty Words. We published it the first year we were in business. And it was done in Irish and in English, and it was looking at the different words that defined that decade. So in 2004 we thought, well, people will still probably remember Ground Zero in 2009. They might remember Botox, Bada Bing if you followed The Sopranos, camera phone. This was pre-iPhone, human traffic, Lewis, spam. So these were words: disposable income, touch sensitive, Googled, burqa, thong, swing voter, Atkins. And there was plays and jokes within the language that was here. Download, Coalition of the Willing, that's Abu Ghraib. Bootylicious, Sexed Up, that's Tony Blair. Home Movie with Paris Hilton. Recreational Drugs with Viagra. X Factor, Labradoodle. So these were different things, like WMD. There's no illustration for that because it didn't exist in Iraq. So these were words that captured the spirit of the noughties. So last year we did a follow-up book, and there's one for you all here, called Teeny Words. So these are the words that define the teenies. If we're no longer in, you can just pass them along. So every year, most years in Zero.
Self-publishing.
Yeah. So most years we try and create something. So first year we did naughty words. A couple of years ago we did teeny words. We did a birdhouse for people's soul one year, and within that each birdhouse was different. And when we sent them to people, they would send us a birdhouse that they had put together. And it would, this was in Berlin, Dottie, we sent her one. So each house was different and personalised, and it came with a book that looked at how your soul migrates. These are the different parts of Buddhism. It looked at different types of souls. It looked at the weight of a soul. So your soul, apparently, according to Duncan MacDougall, weighs 21 grams, where there's actually the world's smallest bird only weighs 1.8. So a hummingbird is lighter than your soul. Other people sent us their, little bit of postmodern intertextuality. So there are other things that we do where we self-publish and we make things, and usually there's a certain degree of commentary, hopefully in a pleasant way that's kind of going on. Another thing that we self-published, I'll leave these if any of you want them. We created a map of the Irish state. So while we had done the work to talk about Ireland as a nation, I'm conscious of time now, so I'm nearly over. People know about a nation. A nation is a cultural construct, where a state, people don't know what it is. And there's no org chart for the Irish state, the Irish government. So we're designing an identity for Irish government that's being rolled out at the moment. So 17 departments and all these different organisations. So we created this so that we could have a conversation about what the Irish state is. If you're coming through, you'll see it's up on the wall. But what it is there's 360 islands, there's 17 departments, and this is now used as a training tool by the government. So civil servants, we sent 1,000 copies to one of the departments that look after government reform. And what it does is it allows them to talk about the organisation of a state. And on one hand, it's structured, but on the other hand, it has to be ambiguous. Because things are on one hand autonomous and independent, and on the other hand, they're part of a system that's trying to look after common. Yeah. So you have the judiciary, and you have the legislature, and then you have the executive. And the size of these different land masses is to do with government expenditure. So you can see arts, heritage, and Irish-speaking areas is this. Whereas, understandably, social protection, so the state pensions, these lakes are full of cash, and they need to be. So the thing is, what we wanted to do was design it so it was not a polemic, it was not a critique, but it was a way of providing a conversation. So it's funny, O'Glenheran is what we call our Irish Army, the Defence Forces. And we had a phone call from the head of communications in the Defence Forces. And he was a little bit upset. He thought the government had done this. Now, we had to find all this information ourselves. It doesn't exist. We contacted universities, we checked websites, we pulled it all together, and then, so some of it was going to be interpreted wrong. Anyway, he phoned up, and what he said exactly was, O'Glenheran, the Irish Army, our Defence Forces, should not be an archipelago of islands. At the very least, they should be joined by a land bridge, and ideally they should be a peninsula coming off the Department of Defence. Now, he was using the language of geography to have a conversation about the relationship between the Irish Defence Forces and the Irish state. And I found that to be a really... because that's what we wanted to do. We wanted people to be able to have a conversation. So we printed a second version of this that we updated, and we invited the head of the army along who was an admiral from the Navy. And I met him when he was in the audience, when we gave a talk with one of the government ministers about the development of this map. And the admiral, who's this guy mentioned here on the map, Admiral Mellish, he said, why have you put a land bridge on the new on the new map? Why aren't we just joined by a boat like we used to be? I said, well, see that guy? So we produced this, and this was exhibited in New York. A bigger version was in New York and Milan and Eindhoven and in Dublin. And so these are things that we publish ourselves. These aren't commercial jobs. But as I said, the government came and asked us for 1,000 maps so that they could use it for people in government. So if you go into the Department of Finance to meet the Minister of Finance, he has that map outside his office. So anyone who's waiting to go in to ask for more money has to pass the map and see themselves on it. So that's it. I'll stop. I think we've gone on long enough. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Well, the only final thing, if I was to do one more thing, is this is what I finished with, is you talk about signs. Derry, that's where Liam McCormick was from. This is a sign near my house about 7-8 years ago. And I was trying to think about when I think about what communication is and I think about what design is. And I use this image sometimes to talk about that. And people think I'm going to talk about the typography and I'm going to talk about the nature of it. But this sign was always bugging me. It was under some trees and it was very prominent. And I thought that it kind of said a lot, not by its typography, but just by its overall demeanor. So I kind of thought, well, what could I do to open up a conversation about this? So I thought about doing a little random act of kindness. What way could I engage with the sign that maybe cause other people to respond to it? So this is what I did. You have to have a high vis, then no one stops you. So I did that.
Okay.
And headed off on my way. So that's how the sign ended up. And it's designed really as a conversation. When we talk about communication design, it's not what we say. It's what the other person receives. I mean, you all know that. But sometimes it can seem, we just look at that in isolation. That's brilliant design. Look how beautifully it's been done. Yeah, well, what's the response? What's the call to action? And sometimes it's not explicit. It's just implicit within itself. And so for me, what was nice was just to kind of pass this sign every day and see at what point would someone clean the other side. So they did eventually, yeah. So but all I did was half. It's the public or the people you're communicating with are there to do and fill in the other half. And so it's a bit like the state. The challenge from a design for that was to leave it open so that it wasn't seen to be a critique, but it was about a platform for a conversation. The work that we did for 2016 was to engage in framing something. All we're doing is framing. We're not the people who know all about this, but we're framing it in a way that means that everyone can be part of that conversation rather than saying this is a party only for these people. And so it's that element of how do we communicate in a way that is both open but with intent. That's I think that what we try and balance or what we try and address. So that's it. There is no more, Eva. We are over. Okay?
I have a question. Well,
Yeah.
actually, it's a big question.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about your creative process, like how you come up with your concepts and
Yeah.
ideas.
Well, it depends. Each person is different. So,
But about like, if you can tell us about the studio in general, and
Yeah.
also maybe
Yeah.
individuals who are really.
Yeah. Yeah. So the way this, yeah,
Meanwhile, can I just like have a
yeah, of course you can. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we use a standard 4-stage process: discovery, definition, creation, and activation. And so I ran the business on my own for 10 years, and then 4 or 5 years ago I took on 2 business partners, and one of those business partners was a guy who ran a company doing research, and his background was in economics and anthropology. And so the reason why JP joined and why we were interested in joining forces is that we shared the same values. Now, we don't do, as a studio, we don't do FMCG, so we're not designing packaging for biscuits and fizzy drinks and all that kind of stuff. But we use the whole process of research and engaging to really try and get under the skin and understand companies. So we tend to work a lot with organizations rather than products. So within that discovery stage, what we'll do is we'll go and we'll interview people. We'll bring people here and we'll maybe do it in groups. We'll sit down one-on-one and talk to people within a company. We'll go and talk to their clients. We'll maybe go and talk to different opinion formers. And what all of that is about is it is about creating the space within which a concept can develop. Though oftentimes you might instinctively have a concept at the start. What you're really doing is preparing the ground in which it can be sown. And the way we look at that discovery process, I'm sure you have these programs in Poland where it's a makeover, where usually a woman has reached a certain moment in her life and some TV presenter / fashion designer will come and say, well, I'm going to show you how to dress well, I'm going to transform you, it's blah, blah, blah. And what you'll see is that there's usually a moment about 8 or 10 minutes into the program where the presenter is standing in front of a mirror with the person who's going to be transformed. And they're wearing one of those flesh-coloured body stockings. And she's going, look at your beautiful thighs, look at your eyes, look at your arms, look who you are. And usually the person starts crying. And I think that you sometimes need to do that process with clients. And what you're trying to do in that moment is get them to look at themselves differently before they worry about looking different. So typically, if you're a design studio or a graphic design studio, people come to you because we want to look different, or we want you to make us look the way you make everyone look. So we don't enter design competitions. You won't see medals on the wall, you won't see certificates put up, I won't be sitting in front of, you should trust me because of all of these awards I have. No, you should trust me because I'm listening to you. Because I can talk to you about you that helps you feel understood and now have the confidence to maybe approach things in a different way. So we go through, the first thing is to interview, to talk, to listen. Everyone here in the studio is trained in facilitation and how to engage and listen, to ask questions, to work in groups. And so that's the first thing that we do. And you're doing desk research, but it's really about establishing and aligning, because when we work, we're not just working with this, it's fine, that's a curator. With doing these self-initiated things, that's fine, I have an idea, we make it, or someone else has an idea and we make it. But when we work commercially, it's that real immersion. And that might mean that we're getting into trucks and driving around parts of England, we're going and visiting printing presses in Bogota, or we're going up to remote parts of Holland to meet some guy who does physics. Depends. So it's about immersing ourselves and building trust. And then we move into a position where we now start to define a concept. And so because we're a brand strategy studio, we have different models that we use to be able to articulate, here's the essence of your idea. These are the different external dimensions of it. These are the underlying culture and values that you want to create. These are the particular competencies that you have and that you might need to extend. So we use models, conceptual models, to define a strategy. And all of that immersion means that you've built a lot of trust that when you then move into the creative stage, you're able to build on that. And when we do creative, it's not, here's 3, pick one. It might be, here's 16. Now, what way do we go? So the way we work is, rather than presenting stuff up here, we might just lay things out on the wall, have clients coming in. The reasons these couches are like this is you can sit on the back. You can rotate and be watching the wall. And so it's very much co-development. It's not we will pitch and you will pick. It's we will move through this together and that the solution will evolve. And then you move over to execution. Now that's our official piece, and when we work on certain projects, it's like that. The government example, 10 days, that wasn't that. I had 50 years of thinking about it because I grew up thinking about it because my dad had been involved in 1966, and a lot of the work that I've done since coming back from working in Holland has been to do with Irish identity and cultural institutions. So we've done the government, I've done the presidency, done the Supreme Court, done the National Museum, done the Ireland identity for overseas. We're currently working with the Department of Foreign Affairs about a positioning for Ireland globally. So I'm kind of know Ireland a little bit. So that stuff I can work on instinctively, but you still need to bring people with you in most of the work that we do.